Welcome to the very first episode of One Man's Trash, the podcast about collecting everything. I'm your host, Levin Parker, and my co host is Michael Cortese.
Hi, I'm Michael Cortese, Noble Spirit in Pittsfield, New Hampshire.
Appreciate having you here, Michael. And because this is our very first episode, we're going to talk about why I named it One Man's Trash and what my philosophy is behind collecting and what really drives markets. But before we do that, we're just going to introduce ourselves and tell you what our experiences are in the collecting fields. My name is Levin Parker. I primarily collect Wyoming postal history, although I have expanded to where I collect all kinds of different ephemera and eclectic items. The weirder, the better. And you probably came here from my TikTok channel where I have over 110,000 followers. Now you can see my shorts content on TikTok, Instagram, or YouTube, as well as visit me at my eBay store and have an opportunity to buy some of the great items we're going to talk about. Michael, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
I've been a collector slash dealer since I was 8 years old. My father got me into the hobby of philately to begin with, but now it's kind of expanded into numismatics and other kind of things. We operate a business out of Pittsfield, New Hampshire, with about 20 employees, and we tackle really every kind of collectible, anything from sports cards to antiques to masks. I mean, it's really kind of a anything our philosophy has been anything you can photograph we can sell, so that's been my collecting area or interest in learning, is just been really eclectic and finding everything that any person can collect and diving into that. I mean, there's no real wrong way to collect anything. So my study primarily, while it has been stamps, it's really been expanding, and I'm excited to jump into this podcast and talk to a lot of different people from a lot of different collecting interests, because it's important to hear other people's stories, and I'm really excited to learn as well as be a part of just so many different areas of collecting.
Well, and I think that's why I asked you to co-host this with me, Michael, because I think there are so many things to be learned from cross disciplines. I did a
Mm,
lot of time and a lot of work being a carpenter and a handyman, and I think what was so fascinating about that job is you would find tools that you use in one discipline of construction that you can use in other disciplines, and I think it makes you a better collector to really understand at its very basic and most simple concept of what drives collectible markets and why we collect the things that we do. And that's kind of the idea behind One Man's Trash, is
mhm.
that everything that I like to collect, no matter what it is, whether it's ephemera or postal history or stamps or whatever the case may be, is something that is unintentionally a collectible, and it has a utility, that it was created for a purpose that was not to be collected, and that the value of it always lay in actually doing something. And I
Mm.
think there's a lot to be learned from that. And I think it's a distinction between collectible markets that a lot of people don't even think about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, my first experience really with this kind of as a youth with this kind of cross collectible area was those first day covers that included the coins in them. They mass market
Yeah.
these silver coins inside the first day covers with the stamps, and it was my first real introduction to, okay, maybe there can be people, I think I was 12 at the time, that collect both areas of items, and this was just marketed to both kinds of collectors. And you see stamp collectors with these items, you see coin collectors with these items, and it's just this cross pollination. So, but I think that your point about the collectibles as a tool, or tools becoming collectibles, is really something that we can dive into a
Yeah,
little bit more.
definitely. And I think that it's really interesting how much more appreciation I get for one thing I collect when I
Mm,
compare it to something else. But I really want to get into that idea of intentional markets, because the first thing that springs to my mind is the spirit of 76,
mm,
is all of the stuff that was issued for America's bicentennial in 1976. And I think it's a great example because it crosses all collecting fields. I mean, whether you're talking about coins or stamps or books or anything, I mean, literally, it had to be $100 trillion industry. Um, the branding for the bicentennial. And to my mind, when I'm going through a collection now, whenever I see anything that's branded that way, it automatically has little to no value, with the exception of some errors that you see on
Yep.
some stamps and coins.
Yeah, that was the first thing that came to mind. Is the first thing you got to look for is those sheets where the
Yes.
numerals have been printed omitted. So
Hmm.
I mean that's the only thing. Otherwise, all the stamps are face value. All the coins, it's spending money. It's something that because it was you see very few of these marketed collectibles that then turn into just actual high value items. USPS's first real modern attempt at this was the uninverted Jenny sheets
Yeah.
that they issued, where they'd issued the $2 inverted Jennies, but then they issued 100 sheets of the uninverted Jennies, the right side up
Hmm.
ones, that then they would hide in packets and
Yeah.
distribute uh, kind of sparsely across the United
I
States for
remember
people to
that
find
craze.
mysteriously.
Yeah.
And they became, incredibly valuable for a
Yep.
very short period of time. There were people, auction houses that were selling them. We sold some ourselves for upwards of 50, 60, $70,000
Hmm.
per sheet. And nowadays, when you find them in auctions, they're 10,000. I mean, the
Wow.
bottom just fell out because they were
Because they're
just
intentional.
created. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
And that's what's funny is that I think that is something that holds true across markets. One of the very first things that I ever collected was football cards, um,
Hmm.
and I vividly remember deeply enjoying my football cards. I had a little metal box with a flip
Yeah.
lid on it that was on a hinge, and it was covered in garbage pail kid stickers. And those cards, I mean, the condition that they had to be in when we threw them away, I mean, they were just torn to death. But what's funny is that the card market actually follows kind of that
Mm.
same trend, where the most valuable cards are the very early cards, which were actually tobacco and advertising cards. And so they actually had a utility to get people to buy a pouch of tobacco, a pack of cigarettes, whatever the case may be. And it's really interesting to me that those are the times when those cards were extraordinarily valuable. And as you go along the timeline of cards and you look at like the 1950s through say the 70s or the 80s when I was collecting, even though they were intended as collectibles, they were intended as tchotchke for children. They weren't
Yep.
intended to hold value. And so you still have the 1952 Topps baseball set that is considered one of the greatest sets, but I
Right.
I firmly believe that the reason that it's considered one of the greatest sets is it was never intended as a real collectible. It was intended as something for kids to enjoy, and I remember very well in the '90s when the companies, when Topps and Upper Deck and everybody started producing cards with the intention of them holding value, and the ridiculous and almost immediate drop off and closure of card shops all across the country. Um,
Hmm.
and it'll be really interesting to see how this modern boom eventually develops with these intentional collectibles, because they are doing some interesting things that go above and beyond some of the other things that have gone before it. But I think that it still holds true that the real value in collectibles is almost always the unintentional and those things that have utility above and beyond collectibles.
Well, even the items of those times, the times the 50s and before, the the survivability of them was very low.
Mhm.
So coins, they put them in PVC holders, and nowadays, there's just you have to get them cleaned. You have to send them in to NGC or PCGS somewhere that's going to conserve them. We've seen collections of, unfortunately 52 manels or just stuck on photo album pages where the
Yeah.
back is just completely destroyed. And it's because and even stamps back then, you put them on the hinges, you put them in the albums. Nowadays, there's a premium on never hinge stamps because the way that people collected back then wasn't really with any sort of cognizant idea of the back of the item in the future being valuable. It was very surface. It was very, hinge the stamp on the album, and you're looking at the front of the stamp. That's it. Put the baseball cards, the football cards in the photo album. They're stuck there,
Mhm.
and it doesn't matter what the back is going to look like because you can see the front.
Yep.
So it was very just kind of surface and no preservation of these items. That's another reason why those items just are so
Well,
much more valuable these days.
and they were being collected for joy. There was
Yeah,
no intention of value. And I think
right.
that lack of intention of value fundamentally changes a market. As soon as you
Hmm.
have the introduction of the intention of something being valuable, it changes the way everything is done in that industry.
Hmm.
And it's funny because even the oldest of collectibles, I mean, and I think stamps are a great example. People think that you've never seen collapses in markets like Funko Pops or Beanie Babies before, but stamps went through that 125 years ago. When you had
Hmm.
there was a guy named Seebeck that I'm sure you know that was running around South America, whose friend's brother, sister's cousin knew the legation from Colombia, and he had this deal where he would offer to print the stamps for free for any country in exchange for the rights to print them in the future, as well as the right to shut down production of that stamp and thus make them shorter print runs. And the only way that business model worked is he would print all of these extra stamps once they were no longer good for postage and sell them to collectors. And this happened in the 1890s, and that's when stamps started being not a utility item, and started being an intentional item for collectors. And to this day, you can get entire sets of Seebeck stamps, that are
Mm.
135 years old in fantastic condition for pennies. I mean, for almost nothing.
And it's
Yeah.
interesting to compare to to forgers and people reproducing stamps that are now put on pedestals these days, where you have like Sperati, where you have entire auctions, like David Feldman
Mhm.
just dedicated an entire auction to Sperati forgeries, selling books and
Yep.
the stamps, where people are buying these stamps that were made with the intention of selling them to collectors for them to put them in their albums because they couldn't afford the real ones, things like that. So it's these stamps sometimes in some
Yeah.
cases, depending on the stamp, are more valuable than the stamp itself. I mean, it's just
Well, and that's
it's crazy.
And that's what's funny is I think even with those items, their utility was not as a collectible to retain value, but their utility
Hmm.
was to defraud somebody,
Yeah.
times out of 10. And so you really have again that driver of something that is unintentional as a collectible. And I was shocked at the realizations
Yeah.
of that forgery auction. I think it's really interesting. And I can tell you, if that was an area I was in, I would be a buyer because I would
Hmm.
absolutely, if I had a fantastic classics US collection, love to have a page of Sperati forgeries right next
Yeah.
to the originals. I mean, that's definitely something I'd be interested in.
And you see it in other markets as well, where you have things like the penning nickel, where
Yeah.
they hold actual value compared to to the same kind of nickel that's genuine, and people are paying money for these fake items that the utility was to defraud people
Yeah.
back then.
And
So
well,
it's interesting.
and not only that, but even as you move into modern times, and I think this is true of stamps, I think this is true of currency, I think this is true of coins. Um, all of the modern issues, they do have a nominal value as postage or as currency.
Hmm.
But in order for anything to get any real serious collectible value, aside from grading, which we'll take on another episode, is to look very seriously at all of the errors. And so again, even when you talk about stamps, I mean, basically anything after 1920, all of the value is going to be in the errors.
Mm.
The only exception to that, and what I find is really funny, is that all of the issues that are intended to be collectible, what stamp collectors call commemoratives, which are going to be issued, in very short quantities and issued for a short period of time, as opposed to definitives, which would be the workhorse of stamps that people would use in offices every day. And when you look at those older sets, anywhere from the 1930s up until present day, all of the highest value stamps that are the most jacked up above their face value are going to be those utility stamps that are being used in offices every single day. And it's not going to be the commemorative stamps that were intentionally produced for collectors and for people to just enjoy the thematics of it.
No, exactly. And you see it in other areas within stamps, like revenue stamps. They're not made for collectors at all. They're
No.
made for the federal government to use as a way to pay taxes. It's one of the hottest areas in philately for collecting, and people take it so seriously. There's massive dealers, there's huge exhibits, and it's one of the areas within stamp collecting that those stamps realize some of the highest percentages of catalog value. And there was no marketing to collect them. I mean, they were just entirely for people to use to pay taxes, and people are just fascinated by that.
Yep, and I think that's true, not just of stamps, but of all kinds of advertising, license
Hmm.
plates, vintage clothing is a great
Yeah,
example. There are so many different markets that all of the value is in those things that were never intended as collectibles, as collectibles. And I think too, because obviously people don't produce things for fun. There has to be a reason that there's all these intentional collectibles. And
right.
the bottom line is that they have value as long as they have cultural relevancy. And that is true of all kinds of different markets that have come and gone. A great example that I think about is movie star autographs, because movie
Mhm.
star autographs have a shelf life. They have a life of about, usually 20, 30, 50 years after that person's death. They'll still hold some value. But like right now, you can go online anywhere, eBay, any auction, and find all of these actors and actresses autographs from the 1920s and the 1930s, that because those films are no longer culturally relevant in today's society, you can buy them for a pittance, for almost nothing, with the
Yeah.
exception of one or two huge stars, say a Marilyn Monroe or a Charlie Chaplin or something along those lines. Aside from that, you lot those up in groups of 100 and sell them
Mhm.
off, because the market for individual signatures has just gone by the wayside.
Yeah. And you see a lot of those people moving into the more memorabilia. I mean, the movie memorabilia and items from the specific movies themselves are incredibly hot. I mean, it's you see that all the time. You see entire sets. I mean, Heritage just had their Game of Thrones sale that was incredibly successful. Um, eh, Stuff like that that just it wasn't again intended to be collected. It had a purpose. It was for the movie. Whereas these signatures are intended to
Hmm.
be given to collectors. They're intended to be thrown on a wall and kind of looked at. The only thing that I'd off the top of my head kind of just say that is almost an opposite market might be paintings, artwork, stuff like that, where the utility is to be appreciated. It's to be the material is to be an elicit an emotion.
And I think that's an important caveat to draw underneath all of this, is that
Hmm.
fine art,
Yeah.
of all disciplines, whether you're talking about fine furniture or gold work or silver work or
Hmm.
paintings or sculptures or whatever the case may be, all of that lies outside of these basic market drivers. And
Yeah.
and I and
Absolutely.
I, and I would argue that there is a utility item around humanity and communication that
Yes.
underlies, but we don't have to get into that today. But
Right.
I do think
Right.
that
That's
is
more philosophical.
yeah,
Yeah.
I do think it's an important caveat to make. And I think what's interesting is that you see this pattern repeat over and over and over again. Like right now, we're watching the absolute collapse of a market in Funko Pops,
Mm.
which people, there are still dealers that are in denial about this, but these days, Funko Pops have just about gone the way of the Beanie Baby, where you had this trailing off of where all of the standard stuff, all of the stuff that is common and able to get has almost no value, which is exactly how it started with Beanie Babies. And then
Mhm.
you'll slowly see that lack of value start to eke up into the upper ends as that cultural relevancy of Funko Pops goes away, and as they just become another collectible that was hot for a short period of time. And it happens over. I mean, you have Funko Pops. You have, from when I was a kid, you have Pogs, which for a
Yeah.
long time, was just a toy for kids, and then it started to be collectible, and you would spend real money collecting some of that stuff, and then again, you have that huge drop off once that goes away. But there's so many great examples of that. And I think that that's why the sports card will be so interesting, is to see what happens with that market, because I think that that market again has some outlying factors that are really interesting that may be drivers there, that
Yeah.
other markets have never had before. So I think it'll be really interesting to see in 20, 30 years where sports cards are sitting at.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely an interesting point because you have sports card collectors that are the celebrities themselves of the players. I mean, Steph Curry famously has this massive basketball card collection of graded basketballs. He's collecting his own cards. He's hyping up these items. So you have the celebrities, the sports players themselves collecting cards made for themselves. They're autographing them and it's interesting to see the modern card market. It fluctuates on the performance of the individual themselves, and it is this almost kind of the modern market's this complete outlier where the prices of the more classic 50s 60s cards are so much more set in stone. They're so much more iconic, and the modern market is almost I've spoken to people. We've got sports cards guys in our office that say, they attribute it to almost gambling
Hmm.
because you're not really sure. He says you buy a Josh Allen card, if he gets hurt while it's in shipping, it could arrive less valuable than you bought it.
Well, and I think there's also an interesting factor in sports where there's this assumption among fans that the cultural relevancy of football,
Mm,
for example, is forever. But people forget that it really wasn't that long ago, say pre 1960, where football was just one more amongst a number of organized sports, and baseball was super dominant, to a point of being incredible. I mean,
yeah.
basketball wasn't even invented until the 1890s, 1900s, and all the way up into the 70s and the 80s. Basketball and hockey were definitely the redheaded stepchildren of organized, yeah, team sports. And it's even shocking to me these days. Hockey cards have gotten so much more. I mean, the idea that
Hmm.
hockey cards would have the value that they do. There was that recent case of the O-Pee-Chee, that had the rookie card of Gretzky in it, and they knew there
Yeah.
were X amount of Gretzky rookies in there, and I can't even remember what it went for, like a couple two, $300,000. But the idea that hockey cards would hold that kind of value from where they started, in the '60s and the '70s is insanity.
Again, an important point to make here is I think we're really tapped into the American markets. I don't know the the market, I'm completely ignorant to the market of the world's most popular sport, soccer or football in the UK. We get some of those cards these times. I mean, we had a Mia Hamm rookie card. It was like 20, $30. We don't really here see that many soccer cards going for a tremendous amount of money. It's the world's most popular sport, but all the cards that are holding this tremendous value, and at least maybe it's because that soccer is not so huge in America, in the United
Well,
States.
and you have to think that there has to be some sort of conditioning among the American market,
Yeah.
towards that has to definitely affect that, because the value of football cards is insanity compare. I mean,
Hmm.
with the number of fans that the soccer has, so it
Yeah.
definitely doesn't have the allure in some foreign destinations that it does here. Otherwise, the prices would be wildly. I mean, a Messi rookie would probably dwarf everything out there as far as football cards.
Right. Right.
Um,
Yeah.
And but I think that that's one of those things that's really interesting is that you have this tie-in in America where you have this absolute fanaticism about sports. And
Mhm.
I think that it ties back into the card market because of the gambling aspect that is so prevalent in American sports. Is I think that that gambling aspect fundamentally makes sports cards a different market than almost any other market. One of the things that I find really interesting is their ability to cut up jerseys, stick them in cards in little plastic holders, and
Yeah.
dramatically increase value. Because any other collectible, you take something that has value and you cut it into 1 by 1 inch squares, and it's not
Yeah.
that you can't divide it out like that. I mean, it destroys the value when you do that. And it's
Mhm.
fascinating that an entire market has accepted that that is now a practice that they encourage and that everybody's looking for because I can't think of another market where that has been found to be acceptable. I mean, it would be like, taking a signature of Abraham Lincoln and chopping it into 15 pieces and putting it on the card.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I mean, it's just insanity.
Yeah. Yeah, the only thing that I'd sort of liken it to, and it's not even a one for one comparison, is the fact that all these used stamps that we have are soaked off of postal history. And
Mhm.
all these cut square collections we see are just, there was an entire envelope and they just cut the embossed portion of the envelope out. It's not exactly the same because they've got this huge jersey and they're just cutting fragments and they're just sticking it in places where, compared to soaking stamps off an envelope, there's a key part. You're looking at the stamp. You're looking at the cancel. You're looking at the circular date
But what's interesting about
pounds.
that to me is that they actually is that when you have those stamps that are cut off of cover, because there are so many of
Hmm.
them, every single one of them has diminished in value
Yep,
having been taken off of that cover. There's not a
absolutely.
single great stamp. I mean, I think the Ice House cover is a great example where, a 90-cent Lincoln pictorial from
Yep,
1869 is an extraordinarily valuable stamp, but the only cover surviving with that stamp on it is an astronomically valuable. I mean, I don't know what
yep.
it's for last time, 500,000 or 750,000,
Something like that. I mean,
something
it's
like
just
that. Yeah, but that's the thing is that they're cutting up these jerseys, and the jersey is actually becoming more valuable when you
yes.
factor all the cards that are made into out of it. And it's
Hmm.
funny because one of the things that I oftentimes tell beginning collectors is that what you want to do in order to judge a collectible, especially something that appears to be made to be a collectible, is judge how much packaging it has. And the more packaging versus collectible ratio that it has, the less
Yeah,
valuable it is, almost without exception. The nicer
yeah.
the
That's
box, the more velvet there is in it. To me, those are red flags that whatever is inside is something that is not going to be very valuable.
there's caveats to everything. So the flip side to that would be the modern, timepiece or watch
Mhm.
market, where you
Well,
have these Rolexes and these Omegas that are just increasing in value over time if you collect them that way.
and they are, and I actually was thinking about just that earlier today because one of the guests that I have lined up on a future podcast is a man named Mike Nouveau, who is
Okay.
a dealer and a collector of vintage luxury watches,
Oh, fantastic.
and he does fantastic collecting content. It's super interesting.
Hmm.
But what I found really interesting as far as the drivers in that market is there's an assumption that because they're made to be kept, that means that their utility is to be collectible. But I don't think that's true. I think the
Mm.
utility in luxury goods like that is as a status symbol. And
Yeah.
so you have this entire market driver that there's assumption because it's $19,000 that it's automatically a collectible. Whereas the reason that people are buying it 9 times out of 10 is not in order to invest $19,000, but they're spending that amount of money in order to have a status symbol. And so I
Hmm.
think, again, that fundamental driver of utility, even in upper end markets like that, isn't necessarily the collectability. It's what it can actually do for you. Because
Yeah.
generally, when you're buying a watch that's $300,000, it is doing something for you other than telling time. So
Yes. Yeah, yeah, exactly.
It's really fascinating, and I think what's really funny is that when you start using it to assess different markets, when you start using that
Yeah.
cultural relevancy to assess different markets, it fundamentally changes my view of what are good collectibles and what are going to hold value over the long term. I mean, I think that books are a great example of something that has great utility, and book collecting has been a thing since the Library of Alexandria. I mean,
Hmm.
it has been something that is dominated humanity ever since the written word has been created, and
Yeah.
it's really interesting how that continues to be true even up until today. And it'll be really interesting how electronic communications affect that desirability in the future, because it becomes the
Mm,
question of, you're no longer collecting the basic utility of knowledge, because for, a couple thousand years, that was the
right.
reason to collect books, was not the aesthetic value, but it was the knowledge value. And now that value base just isn't
Mm,
there with
yeah.
antiquarian books. And I think it'll be really interesting, obviously, probably long after I'm dead, to see how that market develops, and how it changes, and whether or not it will be seen as a precursor to collecting electronic communications. Um,
Yeah.
but that's why I really like right now. I think that collecting computers and video games and things of that nature are going to hold cultural relevancy for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And I think that there are folks that are buying, early Apple computers and all of that stuff right now, that in 40 or 50 years are going to do extraordinarily well on it, because I expect it to dominate the life of most people on the planet.
Yeah, and I think the cultural relevance part is is so important because you see things like people selling, the first iPod sealed in box or the first iPhone sealed in box, and it's going for tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars. But and it always makes the news. But on the other side, I haven't seen, and maybe I'm wrong, I haven't seen, the first Galaxy phone sealed in box sell for the same kind of thing. So the cultural hold that Apple has and some of these technology companies like and entertainment companies like Nintendo and PlayStation have, the hold that they have on our culture is increasing these items over time, and it's not so strong for the kind of lesser. I'm not saying Samsung's lesser, but for some of
Less
the
common.
companies that, right, don't have such a hold on modern culture, because you still see them being sold and valued high, but it's nothing like these, um, like Pokemon sealed in box selling for, tens of thousands. We sold one, a Pokemon Yellow copy. It was graded. It sold for like $5,000.
Yep.
If you'd bought that and kept it in the original box, and those were made in like 1998,
Yep.
it was like $50 to buy, $60.
It's incredible.
That's,
Well, and
yeah.
and I think what's really interesting is it's actually those kind of drivers that will affect markets 50 and 100 years in the future, because that
Mhm,
focus on like Apple products, for example. And I think that Apple deserves all kinds of credit for doing all kinds of innovations, but there are
mhm.
definitely some things that, say, Samsung has done that are less appreciated because they don't have the cachet of the Apple name. That as you get people that are collecting, that are no longer emotionally tied to the branding drivers that we have right now, I think there's every chance in the world that you could see some early Samsung phones that have a special feature that, you know what I mean, whatever the case may
Yeah.
be, however they divide it out. But I think that that could actually contribute to the rarity of some of these other phones, because they were so not popular currently. And it's, when you look back and you look back at the stamp market, we can both think of examples where something exists because everybody thought it was ugly, and now it's a great
Mhm.
rarity because everybody thought that it was ugly.
In addition to what I do at work and collecting areas there, I absolutely love technology and follow it so closely. So the work that Samsung has done, as a company has been phenomenal. And my favorite phone will always be the Galaxy S7 where you could replace the back of the on the Samsung, and I had a leather back on mine, and
Hmm.
it just you didn't need a case on it because the phone itself had a leather back, and that was so earth-shattering to me. And I kept that phone as long as I could. And that is something I'd like to have back, and that is something I'd like to find and, put it on a wall in a frame with
Yeah.
the back facing out because I mean it was just the phone itself wasn't anything special, but the fact that you could just it was almost modular with the back in a way where you could just buy different backs and place it on.
And I think that it has some really interesting implications for some markets that are really huge right now. And the two that jump to mind are stamps and coins, um,
Hmm.
as well as currency, um, because aside, I would say anybody younger than millennials, say anybody under whatever it is, 30 years old or whatever, I don't know. But whatever that works out to be, they don't have any relevancy at all with stamps because by the time they were doing communications, everything was done electronically.
Yep.
And I think that that will eventually happen to coins and currency where you won't have hard money at some point in time. I think there's a good chance of that, and it'll be really interesting to see how that transition is made from being something that is culturally relevant to something that is not. And it makes me very nervous for the stamp market. And I think there's some interesting drivers behind it that everybody can appreciate communication and there's some different things that I think will affect that. Um, but I also think that it starts to make you question why it is you collect what you collect, because I got
Hmm.
into postal history from stamps very, very early on in my collecting career. And the thing that I like about postal history is that it is incredibly relevant in that it's human, in that you understand that people 200 years ago are not dissimilar from you and I.
Hmm.
And I think that there is a market driver that the relevancy behind postal history will be number one history. History is always going to have relevancy. The closer you are to a historical event, and the more involved it is in that historical event, the more valuable it's going to be. But I think the other really interesting driver is voyeurism. Is that
Mm.
when you read people's letters from 100 years ago, or you see who was communicating with each other, it gives you the sense of eavesdropping on people's phone calls.
Yeah.
And I can tell you, I believe 100% that if there were phone recordings of what everybody said in the 1960s, there would be a market for people to purchase and trade those phone recordings,
Hmm.
because they would find it interesting, and that's true of postal history. And so I think that it comes back to that being unintentional and having utility, because I think that one of the things that really drives that unintentional market is that when it is unintentional, when it's not supposed to be a collectible, it's honest.
Yeah.
It,
Yeah.
it when it has a specific purpose, it's something that very much exists for a reason. And I think that doing things like when you start getting into collecting advertising and you take a look at what kind of messages were speaking to people and that were affecting people in the 1940s, or the 1930s or the 20s or whatever the case may be, it's really interesting, and you learn a lot about the type of communities that we had by seeing what was selling to them. One of my favorite items that I ever got was this. It's a little postcard, and it has a picture of a baby sliding down a cheese grater into an axe with like a concerned look on its face. And it's a business card. It looks like the size of a postcard, and it's like one of those red and green lithographs. I'm sure there's deltiological nomenclature for it, but I don't know what it is. But it's from the 1890s, and they were selling stoves. And the reason I found that item so fascinating is that somebody somewhere along the line decided that that extraordinarily disturbing image was going to
Mm.
be something that would sell stoves. That's the only way
Right.
you produce that. And so I started Googling a little bit, and there's like this entire series of business cards that was printed out with these like vaguely disturbing images of different things that are happening, and bad things befalling people. And for whatever reason, it was for a short time a very effective way of
Yeah.
marketing. And I think it adds
Yeah.
it dimension to people that have come before us to understand that, it's easy to think that, well, the 1940s and 50s were really idyllic and this is what spoke to people. But when you start looking at the advertising, you can see how things like misogyny was a huge driver in advertising. Things like
Hmm.
morbid was definitely a driver. And so it's easy to assume that societies are what we see them and what those broad generalizations are that you learn in social studies class, but people are people, and I think that that's the real fascination with collecting the unintentional, is that it gets you closer to other humans and a better understanding of what life was once like.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I mean, we see it a lot with postal history, with again cultural relevance during COVID. I mean, the spike for people looking for medical content
Mm.
or for letters talking about different kinds of influenza, different vaccines, from the 1920s and earlier, or covers that said they've been cleaned or checked for chemicals or Spanish flu, stuff like that. I mean, it that had a huge spike in popularity and it's maintained it. And those always were popular items because people were interested in that time in how people reacted to that kind of news. And, a woman writing to her mother across the country saying, "Oh, my husband has the flu." It's it's always been interesting material that people have collected, but now with it being so top of mind, and even since COVID, people are so worried about illness and ailments. There's almost been another uh, burst of popularity in this looking for medical content
Mhm.
within postal history. Anything that's to a doctor or from a doctor,
Yeah,
has tons of value now.
I love the quarantine letters that they used to do, where
Yep.
they would disinfect letters, and you could find all kinds
Yep.
of chemicals and stuff on them from the
Hmm.
1890s and the early 1900s. You know,
Right.
I think the real takeaway and really the reason I wanted to broach this is there's this tendency, and there's this trend on collecting content on TikTok, at least, to talk about boomer hoarding and how there are these houses full of stuff that people don't
Hmm.
want them and everything has to be thrown away. And I think that the best way to understand what to keep and what to toss when you're looking through all of the stuff that your parents, your grandparents, or whatever that now you have to dispose of, the way to discern what's valuable and what's not is to consider what is intentional. I mean, all
Right.
the stuff that they talk about, things that are no longer valuable that you should be getting rid of, like Danbury mint plaints and the Avon bottles and all of that stuff. All of those were intentional collectibles. But it's
Mhm.
really important not to just dismiss everything, because no matter what it is that you collect that you believe is inherently important, unless it is something that is ultra modern and produced in the last 20 years, it's passing through boomer hands. No
Yep.
matter what it is, whether it be stamps or cards or ephemera or books or whatever the case may be, oftentimes in these large collections of absolute junk, you'll have small pieces of it that are really valuable. And I actually even saw a video of somebody who had I believe it was a Cracker Jack collection, that
Okay.
they had this like room full of advertising and boxes and the toys and I mean, just everything related to Cracker Jack you can imagine. And people were calling it a boomer hoard. And it really kind of blew my mind that people could view things like that and so quickly devalue them, because just they see anything as that kind of clutter. I guess all that I'm saying is that it's important, as people are going through and parsing these collections, if you take a look at those things that your parents or grandparents collected that was not intended to be collected, you're probably going to be on a pretty good route of saving the things that will have value later on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you see it with, like you said, Beanie Babies, Hummels. It's all these markets within stamps. It was golden replicas.
Mm.
We used to sell them at $1.50 each, and now we can't get 10 cents each for them because the modern collector doesn't want them because they were intended to, you know, intended to be collected. And you did a video on golden replicas at one point
I did.
talking about
I
how
yeah.
if you were to peel the golden foil off of them, it would be what did you say was the hourly wage that you would have? It
I,
was like
it was a fraction of a cent. It was
yeah,
because
yeah,
because I think I had yeah, I did the math on it, but I had 500 or
yeah,
900 covers or something, and did the
yeah,
math on how much gold there was in it, and it was just insanity. And
yeah.
especially when you consider what it actually takes to extract gold, and
Hmm.
the chemical processes you have to get used to. I mean, it's just nuts. And I
Yeah,
think that's what's funny is that when you look at those things that are most seriously collected, even in stamps, because you have both the intentional and unintentional in stamps, it's always the unintentional that's valuable. It's
yeah,
always those things that were not intended to be collected that retain their value. And
yeah.
just a heads up for everybody, in following episodes, I have a lineup of fantastic content creators that all do collecting content. We have World War Wisdom, who does World War II reenactments and collects all kinds of different vintage items from that era. We have Ethan, the license plate guy, who obviously is into license plates. He has about a 500,000 followers on TikTok, and it's fascinating. I always disregarded license plates until I started watching his content, and it's so interesting how that idea of unintentionality holds true in those different markets. And
Yeah.
in addition to Mike Nouveau, who I mentioned earlier, that's going to talk to us about luxury vintage watches. I also have Becky Ann Galantine and her boyfriend Josh Rosslin coming on, and they're going to talk to us about oddities. They collect Ouija boards and haunted dolls, and all kinds of ephemera related to funeral homes. They're just some really interesting stuff. So I
I'm
really
really excited about that one. My wife collects that kind of stuff and she's really into that. I'm really excited about that.
That's really awesome. That's very cool. So
Yeah.
yeah, so everybody just stay tuned. We'll have another episode up just as soon as we can. We appreciate you listening. Thanks so much for coming, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Really excited for all of this.